I still remember the exact moment I realized my family had never actually seen me. Not really. I was standing outside the venue in a dress I'd spent 3 weeks saving up for, holding a small gift bag with both hands. And my heart was doing that thing it always does before family events, that tight, anxious flutter, like it already knows something I'm still pretending not to. I told myself this time would be different. I always tell myself that. My younger sister's name is Clarissa. And if you met her, you would understand everything about my family in about 4 minutes. She is the kind of beautiful that rooms notice, the kind of effortless that makes people lean in when she talks, even when she isn't saying anything particularly interesting. Growing up, she never had to try very hard for anything, and because nothing ever required effort from her, she mistook that ease for superiority. My parents never corrected her. If anything, they encouraged it. I am 3 years older. My name is Maya, and I have been working since I was 16 years old. My father left when I was 9 and Clarissa was 6. He came back 4 years later with a new personality, a new girlfriend, and what I can only describe as a selective memory he remembered. Clarissa's laugh and the way she used to mispronounce spaghetti, but he seemed to have no memory of me at all. My mother filled in the gap by simply loving Clarissa enough for 2 parents, which left whatever was left over for me. I don't say this for sympathy. I say it because you need to understand the soil. Something grows in to understand the shape of the tree. By the time I was in my mid-20s, I had built something real, nothing flashy. I worked in event coordination venues, catering logistics, vendor contracts, seating charts, the kind of work that is invisible when it goes right and catastrophic when it goes wrong. I was good at it. I was the person clients called when something fell apart at the last minute, because I stayed calm and I knew how to solve problems that other people stood in front of with their mouths open. My family did not consider this impressive. My mother once told a neighbor that I worked in hospitality, in the tone someone uses when they mean she never quite figured out what she wanted to do. My aunt asked me every Christmas if I had thought about going back to school. Clarissa, who worked in marketing for a skincare brand, once described my job as basically being a party planner, and then laughed in a way that was supposed to be affectionate. I smiled. I always smiled. That is something you learn early when you are the one in the family who does not quite fit. You learn to smile at the thing that stings. You learn to nod. You learn to redirect conversations before they become confrontations, because the confrontation never ends the way it should. The person who finally says something honest is always the one who gets called dramatic. So I smiled, and I worked, and I built my life quietly, and I told myself it was enough. Then Clarissa announced she was getting married. His name is Derek, and he is perfectly pleasant in the way that certain men are good-looking, agreeable, never quite present in a conversation unless sports are involved. I have nothing against Derek. He came to one family dinner before the engagement, shook my hand, asked what I did, and when I told him, he said, "Oh, cool," and turned to ask my mother about the mashed potatoes. He and Clarissa were well matched in that sense. Neither of them were unkind, exactly. They were simply people for whom other people's inner lives did not take up much space. The wedding planning started in January. The wedding was scheduled for a Saturday in late April. In February, my mother called me. She did not open with "How are you?" She opened with "Clarissa needs help with the venue deposit." The original venue they had chosen had increased their minimum spend and Clarissa's budget, which my mother described without any apparent irony as tighter than expected, despite the fact that the engagement ring Derek gave her cost more than my car could not cover the new deposit amount. The number my mother mentioned was $8,000. I want to pause here and tell you something, because this is the part I have turned over in my mind more times than I can count. I did not say yes immediately. I sat with the phone against my ear and I thought about it for several long seconds. I thought about every Christmas dinner where I sat at the edge of the conversation while Clarissa's accomplishments were discussed like a highlight reel. I thought about the birthday where my mother forgot to get me a cake but made a reservation at Clarissa's favorite restaurant to celebrate together. I thought about being 22 and crying in a parking lot after a family dinner where my aunt said I seemed like I was drifting and no one disagreed. And then I thought, she is still my sister. And family is family. And maybe if I do this, something shifts. I said yes. I transferred $8,000 to my mother's account, and my mother said, I knew we could count on you, sweetheart, in the voice she uses when she has already moved on to the next item on her mental list. She did not ask how I had saved that money or what it cost me to give it. She did not say she would tell Clarissa I had done this. She said thank you, and then she said she had to go because Clarissa was calling on the other line. I found out later, much later, that Clarissa believed the deposit shortfall had been covered by a family friend who owed my mother a favor. My name was never mentioned. I kept coordinating the wedding from behind the scenes in ways no one acknowledged. When the catering vendor Clarissa hired sent a contract with a clause that would have allowed them to substitute menu items without notice, which, in my experience, is how you end up with a wedding reception with grocery store salmon, instead of the poached halibut you paid for, I caught it and renegotiated. When the florist double-booked the ceremony space and was going to cancel 3 weeks before the date, I was the one who spent 2 days calling every floral vendor in a 60-mile radius until I found someone who could fill the order at a comparable price. I did not tell Clarissa or my mother about either of these situations. I solved them. I moved on. I want to be honest about why I did that. It was not entirely selfless. Some part of me believed that if I kept showing up, kept being useful, kept quietly making things work, eventually the people I loved would see me. Really see me. Not Maya, who works in hospitality. Maya, who loves them. Maya, who shows up. The week before the wedding, my mother called again. She told me the seating chart had been finalized. She told me it had been a real puzzle fitting everyone in. She told me Derek's family was larger than expected, and several cousins had flown in from out of state. She told me all of this in the cheerful, slightly distracted tone she uses when she is informing me of a fact she finds uncomplicated. Then she told me I would be seated at a table near the back of the reception hall. Table 11. Not with the family. The family tables, her words, were tables 1 through 4, up near the head table where Clarissa and Derek would be seated. I said, I'm not at a family table? She said, sweetheart, there just wasn't room. Derek has so many cousins. You understand? I said, of course. I understood. I always understood. Table 11, it turned out, was positioned near the service entrance, not directly next to it, but close enough that the waitstaff would be moving in and out past that corner of the room for most of the evening. I discovered this on the day of the wedding, when I arrived at the venue an hour early, not because I was listed on any official arrival schedule, but because I had worked with this venue before and I wanted to check that the timeline was on track. It was, because I had helped build the timeline. The venue coordinator, a woman named Priya who I had collaborated with on 3 previous events, came over when she saw me and said, You're not on the guest list as a vendor today, right? You're the sister? She seemed genuinely confused. I told her yes, I was the sister. She gave me a look that was sympathetic in a way I did not want to examine too closely and moved on. I found my seat at table 11. The other guests at my table were 2 of Derek's college friends who did not know anyone, an elderly woman who was some kind of distant connection to his grandmother and who fell asleep during the speeches, and a couple who had driven 4 hours and were visibly relieved to have someone to talk to. They were perfectly nice people. I want to be clear about that. This is not their story, and they did nothing wrong. But I was the sister of the bride, and I was sitting near the service entrance while my mother and my aunt and my 3 cousins sat 40 feet away at a table with a better centerpiece and a clear view of the dance floor. During the cocktail hour, I stood with a glass of white wine and watched my mother greet Derek's family with the warmth she has always reserved for people she wants to impress. She hugged people I had never met with both arms. She laughed at things that were not particularly funny. She touched her own collarbone when she was complimented on her dress, which is something she does when she is deeply pleased with herself. Clarissa floated past me at one point, radiant in the way that brides are when everything is exactly as they imagined it, and she touched my arm and said, "Isn't it perfect?" Without waiting for an answer, I told her she looked beautiful, because she did, and she smiled and turned toward a photographer who was hovering nearby. My aunt, my mother's older sister, who has never in my adult life asked me a question she actually wanted the answer to, found me during cocktail hour and said, with the smile of someone delivering an uncomfortable truth for your own good, "I heard you're back in Table 11 territory. Don't take it personally, sweetheart. It's just logistics." Table 11 territory, like it was a neighborhood I was known to frequent. I smiled. I took a sip of my wine. I said, "Of course." The reception moved inside. I found my seat. I made pleasant conversation with the college friends, whose names were Brandon and Tyler, who were both curious what I did and were genuinely interested when I explained it in a way that did not minimize it. Tyler said his company had just done a corporate event that had been a complete disaster and asked if I had a card. I gave him one. This is not relevant to the story, but it is the kind of thing I remember, the small moments that tell you where your real life is, separate from the performance of family. The toasts happened. My mother gave one. It was lovely and warm, and it traced the story of Clarissa's life in the way you do at a wedding, the funny childhood memory, the proud milestone, the tribute to who she had become. I am not in that story. I did not expect to be, but I sat at Table 11 and listened to my mother describe raising a daughter who became someone remarkable. And I thought about the $8,000, and I thought about the florist I had called 12 times in 2 days, and I thought about the catering contract clause, and I quietly pressed the tines of my fork into my palm under the table until the feeling passed. Dinner was served. The halibut was excellent, because I had made sure of that. Midway through the main course, I saw a small commotion at the head table. Clarissa was leaning toward Derek and speaking quickly, and Derek had the look of a man who has realized something has gone wrong and is hoping it will resolve itself without his involvement. My mother stood up and spoke to one of the waitstaff, who shook his head and then walked away in the direction of the kitchen. I knew that look. I knew that particular choreography. Something had happened with the food service, not the guest meals, but the vendor meals or the staff coordination. Something behind the scenes. I know a venue problem from a catering problem, from a staffing problem, and I knew what this one looked like from 40 feet away. Within approximately 90 seconds, Priya appeared at my table. "I'm so sorry to interrupt your dinner," she said quietly, leaning down toward me. "I know you're not here as a vendor today, but we have a situation with the dessert timing. The cake was supposed to arrive from the bakery by 6:30, and it's now 7:15. The bakery is saying the driver went to the wrong address and our contact number is going to voicemail. I didn't know if—" "What's the bakery's name?" I said. She told me. I knew them. I had worked with their operations manager before on a corporate event. I asked Priya for her phone, called the direct line I had in my own phone memory, and within 4 minutes I had the driver rerouted and an ETA of 25 minutes. I told Priya to push the cake cutting by 30 minutes and fill the gap with the additional appetizer round that most venues keep as a buffer for exactly this kind of delay. She nodded and said, "How did you and I?" Said, "Go. You have 17 things to do right now," and she went. I went back to my halibut. Brandon, sitting across from me, stared for a moment and said, "What just happened?" I said, "Nothing. The cake is running late." He said, "Did you just fix that?" I said, "I just made a phone call." 20 minutes later, my mother appeared at table 11. I saw her coming from across the room, and I felt the familiar tightening, that instinct to prepare, to soften, to be ready to absorb whatever version of herself she was about to present. She looked slightly flustered, which for my mother is the equivalent of visible distress. She looked at me and then looked at Priya, who was moving efficiently across the room, and then looked back at me. She said, "Did you call the bakery?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Priya said you fixed the cake situation." I said, "The driver had the wrong address. It's handled." There was a pause. And then my mother did something that, in its own small way, was more revealing than anything else that had happened that evening. She nodded, said good, thank you, and turned to walk back to table 1. Not, I'm sorry you're sitting back here. Not, I should have had you closer. Not, I don't know what we would have done without you. Good, thank you. And then she walked away. I looked down at my plate. I thought about the $8,000. I thought about table 11 territory. I thought about Derek's college friend Tyler, who had taken my card and seemed genuinely interested in what I did for a living, and about Priya, who had come to find me not because I was the bride's sister, but because I was the person in the room who could actually solve the problem. And I made a decision. It was not a dramatic decision. I did not slam a glass down or deliver a speech. I have seen the version of this moment in movies, where the wronged person stands up and says the perfect devastating thing while everyone falls silent and the music swells. That is not what happened. What happened was this. I finished my dinner. I folded my napkin. I picked up my clutch. I stood up. And I said goodbye to Brandon and Tyler and the nice couple who had driven 4 hours. And I walked to the coat check. And I got my jacket. And I walked out of the venue into the cool evening air. My phone lit up with a text from my mother about 6 minutes later. It said, "Where did you go? Cake is about to be cut." I stood on the sidewalk outside the venue, and I typed back, "Enjoy the cake. I hope the rest of the evening is perfect." Then I put my phone in my bag, and I walked to my car. I want to tell you what I felt in that moment because I think it matters. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel the rush of vindication that I had sometimes imagined in the way you imagine things late at night when you are rehearsing what you should have said. I felt something quieter than that, something that took me a few days to name correctly. I felt like myself, not the version of myself I had been performing for my family for 31 years, the one who understood, the one who adjusted, the one who smiled and sat at table 11 and was grateful for the crumbs of acknowledgement she was given. I felt like the person I was the rest of the time, the person Priya called when something went wrong, the person Tyler wanted to give his company's next event to, the person who had spent 3 weeks saving up for a dress to attend a wedding that her own family had decided was not quite family enough to seat her at table 4. I drove home. I made tea. I sat in my living room in my wedding guest dress, and I cried a little. Not from sadness exactly, but from the feeling of putting something down that you have been carrying so long you forgot it had weight. The fallout was not immediate. Clarissa texted the next morning. "Mom said you left early. Are you okay?" I told her yes, I was fine. I had not been feeling well. This was partially true. I sent her a message saying I hoped the rest of the evening had been wonderful and that she and Derek looked genuinely happy together, because they had and they did. My mother called 2 days after the wedding. She did not open with "How are you?" She opened with, "I want to talk about Saturday." I said, "Okay." She said that it had been noticed her word, noticed that I had left before the cake cutting and before the dancing, and that some people had found it strange. She said that Clarissa had been a little hurt. She said that after everything that had gone into making the evening special, it seemed like I could have made more of an effort. I let her finish, and then I said very calmly, in the voice I use when I am managing a vendor who has made a serious error and we both know it, "I transferred $8,000 to your account in February to cover the venue deposit. I renegotiated the catering contract to protect Clarissa from a clause that would have let them change the menu without notice. I spent 2 days finding a replacement florist when the original one canceled 3 weeks out. I fixed the cake situation on Saturday night so the reception didn't end on a crisis. I did all of this without being thanked, without being acknowledged, and while sitting at table 11 near the service entrance, I paused. Then I said, I am not the one who needs to make more of an effort. There was a long silence. My mother said, in a different voice than before, I didn't know you had done all of that. I said, I know. Another silence. Then she said, why didn't you say something? And I thought about every version of that question, all the ways it could be unpacked, all the years that lived inside it. And I said, very gently, not cruelly, because I was always waiting for you to notice. That conversation did not fix everything. These things rarely do, not all at once. But it was the first conversation I had ever had with my mother where I felt I was speaking as myself, the whole self, and not the edited version I had always offered up in her presence. She was quiet for a long time. Before we hung up, she said, "I think I owe you an apology." She said it the way people say things they mean, but do not yet entirely know how to feel carefully, like it might break. I said, "It's a start." Clarissa called 3 days later. She had talked to my mother, she said, and she had learned some things she hadn't known. Her voice was different from my mother's, less careful, more unsteady. The voice of someone genuinely surprised by their own blindness. She said she hadn't realized about the deposit. She said she hadn't known about the florist. She said that when the cake had arrived perfectly on time, she had just assumed it had worked out. I told her I understood. I told her that was exactly the problem. She asked if we could have lunch, just the two of us, before she left for her honeymoon. I said yes, we did. It was the first lunch we had ever had as adults, where Clarissa asked me about my actual life, not "How's work?" the way you ask someone to be polite, but genuine questions. What had I been working on? What did I actually like about my job? Had I always been this good at fixing things, or was it something I had learned? I told her I had learned it because I had always had to figure things out myself. She was quiet when I said that. She didn't deflect it or smooth it over. She just sat with it. That, more than anything, felt like progress. I did not get a call from my aunt about Table 11. I did not get an apology from the universe for the years of feeling slightly outside the frame in my own family. None of that arrives in a clean package. But something shifted, and I could feel it the way you feel, a season changing not in one dramatic moment, but in a series of small things that add up. A few weeks later, Tyler from the wedding emailed me through my business account. The budget was significant, and the timeline was tight, and he said he had thought about the way I had handled the cake situation, and he wanted someone who could do that for a room full of executives and a catering team with a complicated setup. I took the meeting. I took the contract. The event went beautifully. I have thought a lot about what it means to be the person in a room who solves the problem that everyone else is panicking about, and then gets seated at table 11. I have thought about why I allowed that for as long as I did. I have thought about the $8,000 and the 12 phone calls and the renegotiated contract. All of it invisible. All of it given freely, in the hope that showing up would eventually teach my family to see me. What I know now is that being seen is not a reward you earn by being useful enough. It is something you ask for. It is something you demand, quietly or loudly depending on the day, and then you wait to find out if the person you are asking actually has the capacity to give it. My mother has been slowly working on that capacity. Clarissa is trying. I do not know what the future of my family looks like, whether this becomes the story of how things turned around, or whether it becomes the story of how I finally stopped waiting. Maybe both. These things are not mutually exclusive. What I know is this. I left a wedding before the cake was cut, and I drove home, and I made tea, and I sat in my living room, and I felt, for the first time in as long as I can remember, completely at peace. Not because I had won something, because I had finally stopped pretending the table I was being offered was the one I deserved.